Please give a warm welcome to Chris Guillebeau.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sealy Pines. You're amazing as ever. And my appreciation as well to the sponsors and beautiful venue. And my most gratitude to all of you for coming out and sharing this space. So, good news and bad news. Bad news, I've been recovering from a pretty severe cold this week. Good news is I'm jacked up on antibiotics, and I just had a donut. So I'm feeling pretty good at the moment, and I predict a 22-minute window of coherence or so. That's what I'm going for. So as long as I don't faint or something, if I get off topic, you'll be the first to know. As Sealy mentioned, we have a new book, The $100 Startup, that comes out next week. But today I would actually like to talk about something different. I want to talk about this concept of creative work as a way of life. And so we'll do that through three specific topics: happiness, legacy, and urgency. And the story begins with a trip I took a few months ago. I was traveling to Madagascar in southern Africa. And before I went out on my trip, I'm packing up and getting all my stuff ready, getting my laptop ready, and setting up things on my iPad. So I'm downloading some Kindle books and updating everything, and I see this game for sale in the iTunes store, and it's only $1.99. So I think, okay, go ahead and download that. And I don't know if you've ever played one of these games where you're kind of the omniscient overlord of this environment, kind of like a SimCity thing or Civilization or Farmville. And you have all these little tasks you got to create and variables you have to manipulate, and so you're in charge of this environment and things interact. So in this game, the object was to kind of construct a tower. And as you play this game, you've got different shops and things that are being installed, new floors going up, and residents are moving in. So you have to kind of keep people happy, keep the stores stocked, and all of that. So I downloaded this game thinking it would be a brief diversion. And long story short, on my first flight, I think it was Seattle to Frankfurt, about 10 hours, I probably played that game about 7 or 8 hours. I just could not stop. Like, I start playing, I'm like, oh, this is so fun. And I'm like stocking my sushi shop, and like there's a bakery moving in, and a record store, and and John just moved into the apartment. I got to make sure he's happy. And I would put the game down for a few minutes, and then I would pick it back up again. And I noticed that things changed during the time that I put the game down, and some of the inventory had been depleted, and I had to fix that problem, and somebody was no longer happy in their work, and I had to address that, and so it just created even more of a kind of a compulsion to play this game, and so at first I think, oh, this is really fun, I love this is great, and it takes a few days to get to Madagascar, so I had some layovers. And one night in Frankfurt, I woke up from jet lag, and I was like, oh, I'm so happy to be awake because now I can get another round in the game, before the morning. This is it's going to put me ahead. So after I'd done this a couple of days, I start to kind of realize that, in fact, I'm not really enjoying this. It's kind of actually draining, to me, and I'm not doing what I need to be doing with my work, and in fact, it's kind of like a false construct here. I'm not really actually accomplishing anything. I'm just clicking little things, and coins are being added to my imaginary bank account, but nothing's really happening. So, finally just got upset with myself and uninstalled the game. I'm like, done with that. Went on with the rest of my trip. So I go back to traveling and working, and then I start thinking, a bit later, I'm like, what was it about that game that was not just interesting? It wasn't just a diversion. It was, in fact, very compelling. Why did I have to spend so much time on it, and why did I enjoy it for that brief window of time? And I realized that there were a few specific characteristics that kind of combined, to make that possible. And the first thing was there was a clear goal. There was no end to the game, but nevertheless, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. I was building this tower, and like more floors would be installed, and that's what I had to do. Had to click certain things, and certain results would be achieved. And the second thing was continuous improvement. It just kept getting better. I add a new floor, and more residents would move in, and then I would upgrade my elevator, and it would go faster. So I keep making progress, towards something. And then there were rewards and achievement. If I did my job, I'd receive praise and attention. Like Mary would be happy; she'd give me a gold star. Extra coins in the bank account. So I just kind of keep going because I'm incentivized, to do so. And then I had very specific deliverables. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The tasks were very specific, and very certain. As long as I did X, then Y would result. And then lastly was this question of influence. The environment, false as it was, it depended on my engagement with it. And so I was kind of the ultimate overlord of this. And my imaginary residents, were dependent on me. And so I felt like I had this, influence, over the whole environment. And in fact, for that brief, fleeting amount of time, the game made me happy. And I had these feelings of happiness, as I played it, even though I realized later, that it was fleeting. And so it made me think more about happiness. And there's a lot of different definitions of what happiness is. And some definitions are that happiness is simply the absence of pain, or happiness is continuously bettering one's circumstances. And there's also religious definitions or faith-based definitions. There's philosophical definitions of happiness. So all these different things about happiness. But it just made me wonder, what if there was another definition? What if there was another framework that we could think about when we think about happiness? And what if we could fill our lives with productive work that actually made a difference in the world? And what if that creative work were a lens in which we lived our lives and thought about the rest of the world? Not necessarily in opposition to those other definitions of happiness, but maybe as an accompaniment, or maybe as something to add on. And so when I'm not traveling to Madagascar or writing about starting a business for $100, I spend a lot of time considering the question of legacy and of legacy projects. And so when I use that word legacy, I don't think of anything to do with money or anything to do with inheritance or even which career you choose necessarily. For me, legacy is a question of community, of connection, and of influence. It's what will we ultimately leave behind. And I really like this quote from Mary Oliver, who says, "What shall we do with our one wild and precious life?" With all of the opportunities available to us and all of the freedoms that most of us have. What shall we do? And so I like to break this down a little bit further into what I call the two most important questions of the universe. Question number one, what do we really want to get out of life? Because a lot of people don't know what they want. They don't know what they're working for. So I think if you can figure it out, that's great. But then secondly, what can we offer the world? And that's that question of connection, of community, of influence, of actually making something that benefits others. So one way of thinking about legacy is through this concept of creative work as a way of life, of making something that matters and is appreciated by other people. So here's a few examples of that. This first one is a little bit self-serving, just because I'm a part of it, but thankfully I'm not the only one who's a part of it. And this is the World Domination Summit, which is an annual event that we host every year in Portland. Last year we had about 500 people, and this time we have 1,000 coming in July from all over the world. And this is just a gathering of creative people from all walks of life. It's very diverse. Some are artists and designers, others are entrepreneurs. Some are longtime travelers, some are students, some are people just kind of figuring out what to do with themselves. And so we have this gathering space for possibility and examine different things about life, work, and travel. And I do that with a team that includes Celie and some other folks who are here today. Another example that's less self-serving, a friend of mine, Thomas Hawk, who I'm sure many of you know through his great photography work. Thomas has a day job and he has a family. He's pretty busy, but every other waking hour is filled with this quest that he has to shoot and process 1 million photos. And I'm not sure what number he's on now, but as you can see, either here in his Flickr stream or on Google+, it's not just any photos. He's a very skilled and experienced photographer, but he also has this compulsion, just to kind of keep going and keep making things and delivering them and sharing them with the world. One more example that you're all familiar with, you either know or you know of her, is Tina Roth-Eisenberg, or Swiss Miss. And indirectly, Tina is the reason why we're here today. And I like this quote from Tina. She says, "All I want to be is a person who wasn't afraid to start things." And so, Tina has started a lot of things, and one of those things was Creative Mornings, which, as Celie shared, is now worldwide. And it's this gathering space where we come together and talk about creative work in different facets. And this exists because of the vision that she had, and then it existed locally because Celie came along and stepped up and made it happen. And then, as great as Celie is, she couldn't do it all herself. She needed sponsors and help and venue and team and volunteers. And then really, the whole circle kind of completes with all of you, coming out, signing up for tickets and tweeting about it and coming. So, these are a few examples of creative work as a way of life. And when you think about that, creative work always involves some amount of trade-off or sacrifice. Jim Rohn said, we must all sacrifice one of two things, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret and disappointment. So to produce something over time, it requires the pain of discipline, but I think that's much preferable, to the pain of regret or disappointment. And it's also a good and worthy sacrifice. Sacrifice sometimes has a negative connotation, but sacrifice also often means just, giving something up to achieve something better. My wife Jolie is here today, and she and I, a few years ago, had the privilege of spending several years in West Africa. And we were volunteering for a medical charity, and it was a great transformative experience for us. And we would come home from time to time, and people would say things like, "Oh, it's very sacrificial, what you've done, to help people over there." And we would say, "Well, hopefully we are, making a difference in some people's lives, but it's not necessarily sacrificial because we're benefiting from this, as well." So I call it selfish generosity. As we seek to give and as we seek to engage, we ourselves are made better through it. So, let's go back to those characteristics that I talked about, when I was addicted to this game, and think about maybe how we could apply this in creative work and something that we're building. So, when you have a clear goal, it doesn't necessarily mean you have, a complete end in mind. Just like with the game, I was just, continuing to build. But nevertheless, if you have a clear goal, then you have the knowledge, that you're working towards something. You have the knowledge, like you have something in sight, that you're going toward. And, when you have continuous improvement, it's the awareness that you're making, small and steady improvements along the way, just small little achievements as you go along. I think it's very difficult to build something over a long period of time without stepping stones, without milestones. And I'm sure there are examples of people who've done it. But I think most of us, we need to see improvement as we go along. And we also need to have rewards and achievement. We need feedback. We need incentives. We need interaction. We need involvement in some way. And then, the more you can include deliverables, specific ones, in your project, so much the better. So there's two problems that many of us have, on an average week, and we'll do a little survey here. Okay, so first problem, I have so much to do. Would you raise your hand if you ever struggle with that? Honest people here today, very good. Second problem, I don't know what to do next. Would you raise your hand if you ever struggle with that? Okay, so open question, which problem is worse? Who thinks, raise your hand if you think the first problem is worse. I have so much to do. Raise your hand if you think the second problem is worse. I don't know what to do next, right? The thing is, if we have so much to do, it's not that complicated. We just put our mind to it. We get shit done. We make a list, right? We knock it out, or we can take things off the list, whatever we have to do. But, if we don't know what to do next, it's the uncertainty of it. It's the what it's this vague thing, and it enables procrastination, and it enables us to just kind of become defocused from our vision. So the more specific deliverables, the better. And the last thing is the question of influence. We want to know that what we do is important. We want to know that we're contributing to something greater than ourselves. We want to know that people are counting on us, just as my imaginary citizens were counting on me in the game. And we want to know that ultimately we're producing something that is making some kind of difference in the world, and that's that question of influence, which relates to question of legacy. So, one suggestion, if you're thinking about this and you're like, oh, this sounds great, like I want to have my own legacy project, but I don't know what to do. I can't take 1 million photos, like somebody's already got that. I can't start Creative Mornings, like maybe I could start Creative Mornings Beaverton, but a lot of stuff's already taken. If you don't know what to do, and you're just trying to figure this out, you're like, oh, I've got a job, I've got obligations, whatever. So that's fine. Here's a daily 2-step plan of action. Here's what you have to do. Okay, every day you do these 2 things in different ways. You help someone, and you make something. And I would suggest that everyone can do this, regardless of your employment situation, regardless of your other obligations. If you wake up and you're like, I've got so much to do, then here's the answer, right? Figure out someone you can help and figure out something that you can make. And the more you do that, I think the closer you get to this question of figuring out, legacy project and figuring out the clear goal and what it is that you're ultimately working for, if you're not certain. So, there was one more thing that helped to make the game so compelling to me. In addition to everything else that I mentioned, one more thing that kind of pushed it from diversion to I must play this, all the time. And that thing was a sense of urgency and a sense that, time was running out. And even though it was a false construct, if I didn't respond to those people's needs, if I didn't stock the sushi shop, then bad things were going to happen. And I had to take action now, as opposed to waiting, later. Again, I felt like time was running out. It wasn't just that it was fun. It was also, there was a little bit of a negative, reinforcement as well, because I felt like I'd be letting people down, if I didn't play. But also in a positive sense, I was driven to produce. I was inspired by this continuous cycle, of making things and seeing the tower grow and seeing like the influence in this world and seeing the interaction and engagement. And so, I live in Southeast Portland, and when I'm not traveling, usually every weekend I go for a long run, and I often begin in Lone Fir Cemetery. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a beautiful place. It's very well maintained and well cared for, and there's no better place to think about things like legacy and the fact that time is running out than a cemetery, right? And I like this place because many of the graves are more than 200 years old. So you can kind of imagine the stories of people who lived long ago. It's also multi-faith and multicultural. A lot of the headstones are written in Cyrillic or other languages. So it's like you go and you have this broad story of, of people who lived a long time ago. And I often go and think about these people's lives, whom I didn't know, but I can only imagine. And I think, like, what was life like, 200 years ago for these people? And surely it was much different, from our lives. And you never want to kind of, look back and apply something to someone else, because every generation, always believes they're more self-enlightened than the previous one. So, they probably had great lives as well, but, or at least some of them did. But I think it's fair to say that, people who lived 200 years ago didn't have the same opportunities that we have, at least in terms of the ability for a broad connection and the ability to, reach out and connect with people, to create communities, based on psychographics, based on shared worldviews, to connect with creative people as we do this morning, both locally and all over the world. And so I think, all we can think about is the time that we have and the lives that we have. And so then the question is, what is our responsibility to that, to all of those opportunities? And so with all of the change that took place, from 200 years ago to now, the one thing that doesn't change is the fact that time is limited. There is this situation of urgency, and therefore we have that question from Mary Oliver, what shall we do with this one wild and precious life? And that's what I think about in different ways of my work. So with the great freedom and the numerous opportunities that we have, I think there's a couple of different perspectives on what to do with it. And one perspective is to withdraw into ourselves, to kind of internalize and just improve ourselves. And the alternative is to embrace the opportunities and to use them to build something, right? To create, to connect, to focus on community, and to choose to care. So for those of us who self-select and say, yes, I want to find a way to make creative work a central part of my life, I'm willing to make that sacrifice of discipline, I want to turn this value into a daily habit. I'd remind you of something that Steve Jobs said. And Steve Jobs said, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. And I think my window of coherence is drawing to a close here, but I will look forward to having another donut, and I will look forward to talking with many of you as well. And I'm very grateful to Sealy for providing this space, and I'm most grateful to all of you for being here. So thanks for coming out. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Okay,
if you want to.
okay, that's great. Thank you. So we can do questions, and we can talk about anything you want. It doesn't have to be necessarily related to this subject, but anything that's on your mind. When am I going to get to the moon? Great question. Yeah, so I have 8 countries left. As Sealy mentioned, I've been doing this more or less for about 10 years. Depending on how you count it. And so 1 more year to go and 8 more countries. And I'm going to Antarctica at the end, but that's not quite as exciting as the moon. So, Virgin Atlantic has this thing where you can pay $200,000 and go into space, but you don't actually get to go to the moon. So for $200K, I would want to go all the way. Yes, sir. How do you balance the day-to-day with the long-term, bearing in mind the question of urgency? So, I think there could be a few different answers to that. The one that I would give would be, if you have the long-term goal, if you know what you're working toward, then you base the day-to-day off of what is required to get there, right? And there's going to be a variety of steps, involved, to go from where you are to where you want to be. And so, in my work as a writer, let's just take a very practical project and say, okay, I want to write a book, All right, that my goal is to write a book. A book is, on average, 70,000 words, okay? How long is it going to take me to write 70,000 words? Well, personally, I have my own little quota of writing 1,000 words a day. Okay, so my goal is no matter what happens, no matter how busy things are, I'm going to try to find a way to make that 1,000 words a day. Now, I'm probably going to do that 5 or 6 days a week. Probably won't hit all 7, but 5 or 6 days. So I kind of extrapolate that. Okay, maybe 100 days of writing, to get to that 70,000 words. Now, of course, not all words are going to be great. There's going to be a lot of editing that's going to be involved, but I'm going to say, okay, it's going to take 100 days to get to that, initial milestone. My next milestone will be editing, probably another 3 months, there. But the point is I'm kind of breaking everything down, long-term into what relates to the day-to-day. And the same is true with traveling. And the same is true with building a business, or with, I would say, any kind of creative project that you maintain that vision, but the day-to-day aligns with where you're going, hopefully. Yes, sir?
You mentioned helping someone and making something. As creatives, we often spend a lot of our time making something, but there's not always the space to help someone or someone requesting help. How do you achieve that or go towards that?
Great. So how do you help someone if there's not something specific in front of you, perhaps? Again, a number of different answers. I would say, first of all, be available. First of all, listen, pay attention, especially if you're working with a team or you're working with groups. When you check in with people, it's not just, hey, how's it going? But hey, is there something I can do for you today? Or maybe even being proactive, in that. So that's if you're working with people. If you're, building your own platform one way or another, then you can do that with your readers or your followers or your fans or whoever, that network is. Jonathan Fields is a good friend of mine. He wrote the book Uncertainty. And for, I think, a year, every day he went on Twitter, and his first post of the day was like, good morning, is there something I can help with? And he's just asking this very generic question. And at first I thought, like, this is kind of general, like, who's going to, respond to this? But he had a lot of fun stories that came out of that. And people just asked for different things, and they wanted engagement on different levels or advice or, sometimes even trivial things. But, I think sometimes we close ourselves off and we're like, oh, we don't have time to do that. But it actually, is probably going to help us as well as we reach out and help people, right? Yes, and you had a question here too.
What's the most trouble you've been in legally overseas?
Okay, the most trouble I've been in legally overseas. So legally, define that for me.
Out of respect for the law.
Okay, out of respect for the law. Okay, so back in the day, I was a high school dropout and juvenile delinquent, so I didn't actually begin very well in life. But fortunately, I kind of progressed a little bit. In terms of travel, people often ask, like, what's the worst thing that's happened? And, out of 185 countries, like, I've had some negative experiences. I always say, like, I've had, like, far, far, far more positive experiences, and I'm treated, like, extremely well, all over the world, in all kinds of countries that are supposedly hostile to the U.S. or hostile to the Western world. I mean, very infrequently do I actually have problems. But having said that, a couple of months ago, I went to Eritrea, and I did get deported, like, immediately upon arrival. So that wasn't the best situation. I was kind of there for a few hours in the middle of the night, and they were discussing what to do with me and all that, but finally they just kicked me out, and I went back to Cairo. But it was okay. Did you have a question here?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do you find time, or what time do you use for your, like, self-reflection? I mean, helping others is,
Right.
great and all, but, like, how do you kind of get it together in your head? Like, I know you got the December hiatus thing, but, like, on a day-to-day basis or the runs, or?
Sure. So he's asking about, I don't know, how did you put it? Something about internalizing. How do you kind of, like, focus yourself? How do you,
Make plans for your legacy.
how do you make plans for, how do you make plans? Sure. Sure, of course. So you mentioned the December thing. I do this thing every year called an annual review, where Jolie and I will go away for a week, and I spend, like, a whole week kind of, thinking about my plans for the next year and what projects do I want to achieve, and what, sacrifice will I need to make to achieve those projects. And so there I'm trying to be more intentional instead of just responding to all the stuff that comes. But I also try to do that on a pretty regular basis as well, not so intensely, but I like the weekly review, David Allen getting things done method. I think that's good. Once a week, just kind of clearing things out and looking at everything, and because it is easy to kind of, like, get into the mundane. And so I usually do that once a week. Up here, so sorry. Go ahead, please.
How do I contact the volunteer coordinator for the World Domination Summit?
She's here today, actually. Well, maybe I'm not supposed to say that. Just come and talk with one of us afterwards.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes, you had a question?
I have a question. I feel like I struggle the most with prioritizing my own goals and dreams against those of others.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you've had that struggle, and if so, kind of how you manage trying to stay on target as opposed to putting out other people's fires.
Right. Great question. The maintaining the, I hate the word balance actually, but I'll use it for a moment. Maintaining the balance between, like, you're maintaining your own goals versus the things you're doing for other people. I tend to believe that your own goals are very important, and I don't think you have to apologize for that. And I think you're going to be a better person by pursuing your own goals. And I think at a certain point you do have to make that a priority. And so choosing to help people doesn't necessarily mean you're putting out everyone's fire, as you said. Choosing to help people doesn't mean you're a doormat, Because some cases, maybe the best way you can help someone is to say, no, I can't help you with that, right? So I think there's a difference between, helping people and defining your life entirely based on someone else's obligations or expectations. The central point of, I run this blog, The Art of Nonconformity. The central message of The Art of Nonconformity is you don't have to live your life the way other people expect you to. And you can do good things for yourself and for others at the same time. It's not a false choice. It's not a dichotomy. So maybe there's a certain amount of balance there, but I don't believe it is a choice, between, being a good person and having your own dreams and goals. Yes, sir?
Do you see making something and helping someone, are those mutually exclusive, or are they combined? You make something to help someone.
I think they could be either one. I think they could be combined. Depends on what you're talking about. If you're making a creative project, presumably you want that creative project to be known or appreciated in some form, right? So maybe ultimately that will help people. I just like to have that additional thing about helping people because at least for myself, speaking only for myself, I can sometimes withdraw and I can sometimes focus only on what I'm doing, and at least for me that kind of leads to like this insular world, maybe even a little bit of depression and like overly self-focused. And so if I can step out of that a little bit and maybe also do something else that really makes the world a better place without bringing attention to myself, then I think that's good as well, Yes?
Will you tell me a little bit more about what you do at this annual review?
What I do at the annual review? So we started this, I think in 2006 or something, 2005, Jolie says. And, at the time we began, we were coming off this commitment of living in Africa and preparing to move back to the US. And just kind of thinking questions about, what do we want our life to be like and what do we hope to do. There's a really great book that I always recommend called Wishcraft by Barbara Scher, and it has a lot of really fun exercises for kind of thinking through these questions. And so I had read Barbara's book, and that first time, I just set out by making a list of things like, what do I hope to achieve in 5 years? What do I hope to do in 1 year, and 3 years. So that on one hand, I have like the goals, okay? And then the other hand, I have more like daily life, okay? So the goals are like what I'm working toward. The daily life is, what does Tuesday morning look like? What does the weekend look like? What kind of exercise do I do? What kind of hobbies do I do? How do I feel different amounts of work time? I was preparing to go to grad school at the time, so I was thinking about how do I factor that in. So a combination of thinking about goals and thinking about daily life, that's how it began for me. And then, the next year and every year since, I take usually 5 or 6 days to do this, not all day, but just kind of broken up throughout the day. And the first day or two is looking back on the previous year and asking 2 questions. First of all, what went well? And then secondly, what did not go well? And most of the time, at least I find I'm going to probably achieve maybe 70% of what I hoped for, and then 30% I didn't. And so I kind of evaluate and say, okay, did I just not want to do those things, or did something happen to cause a change there? Is it something I really want to do in the future, or should I just write it off? So it's just kind of introspective, process of thinking these things through. And then by the end of the week, I have the goals, set for the next year, and I kind of categorize them in different areas. So like professional, family, health, savings, charity work, stuff like that. Yes?
Traveling the world isn't cheap.
Sure.
How do you align, the financial goals with your other goals?
Great question. Traveling the world isn't cheap. So how do you align, those financial goals with other goals? Okay. I would say a couple of things about this. I would say, first of all, a lot of the travel that I've been able to do has been fairly cheap because, I do this thing called travel hacking where I earn a lot of frequent flyer miles through various bonuses, done a lot of round-the-world plane tickets. I've kind of learned to travel, on the cheap, and I write about that a fair amount. But I would also say, at least for me, it was a question of priorities, and it was a question of okay, I'm not independently wealthy. Like I'm self-employed. I make my own income, but I don't have like a trust fund or anything like that. So how can I, how do I choose what I want to do? And so it was a question of prioritization, and it was a question of, okay, moving back to the States after 4 years overseas, do we really need to own a car? We talked about that. We lived in Seattle for a couple years and before we moved to Portland, and we decided, no, we don't need to own a car. It's okay. We can ride the bus and sort that out. So I'm gonna, it's like I'm gonna make choices in one area that allow, for possibilities in other areas. I always tell people if you want to travel, it is possible. Like for most of us, I mean, maybe you don't go to 180 countries, but it's not that expensive. You can save $2 a day, for 6 months, and you can go anywhere in the world, right? So I would say, one, I try to do it on the cheap, but then also it's a value. I've chosen to value travel, so that's what I do. Yes, 1 second. Let me go with you first.
When you decided to go and volunteer in Africa, what was the reception from your friends and family to that announcement, and how did you react? How did you handle that?
Okay, great.
Assuming there would be a little bit of...
Right. So when we decided to go to Africa, what was the reaction from friends and family, and how did we kind of deal with that? I would say that most of our family was pretty supportive. Most of our friends were supportive, at least once they kind of understood, what it is we wanted to do, and we explained some of our motivations. And our motivations were, just after 9/11, we're trying to figure out what to do with our lives and wanted to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And there was this great opportunity, so we took it. It's true that other people were a bit less comfortable, with it in the beginning, and a little bit of resistance. And I think whenever you pursue a dream, whenever you pursue something, especially that involves a lot of change, then it's quite normal, to encounter resistance, or at least, uncomfortableness, or, a sense of foreignness, And, I always say that most of the time, people just need to get used to something, and it does get better, And people who really love you, like they will want you to pursue your dream in the long run. Maybe at first they're just not comfortable with it, but usually in the long run they'll come around. And if they don't, it's their loss, Do we have time for a couple more questions? One more question. Okay, one more question. Sir, in the middle.
Just on the question of West Africa, can you seem to suggest that it was quite a transformative event for you. Can you just speak to some of what that transformation was? Were there any transitions in how you view life, and your goals and all that?
Great. So the question was about those years that we spent in West Africa and the transformation. What was it like? So I guess before we went to Sierra Leone, which is where we were first for a year, I had traveled a fair amount. Julie had traveled some too, but we had never been to Africa. And at the time, Sierra Leone was number 174 out of 174 countries on the Human Development Index. It was just coming out of this long series of civil wars. And so we really hadn't encountered an experience like that before. And so, landing there, we were on a hospital ship, and we were there for about 6 months on the initial stay. We immediately kind of encountered this dichotomy. And the dichotomy is like, on the one hand, the situation is quite desperate for many people. Just coming out of the Civil War, there's no water supply, there's no electricity, unemployment is 80% or more, and most people are just kind of struggling to get by. On the other hand, most people are also fairly joyful. And, people, I walk around the port and everyone's like, good morning, how are you? And just realizing, how people make of what they can with their circumstances. And it was a beautiful place with beautiful people. And so the first part of it is probably just kind of absorbing that and, thinking about the situation and how can we be a part of improving something, not doing it ourselves, but of course working with other people to do it. But then how does this affect our lives? So I guess for us, we were fairly young when we went there, and we didn't have much of a worldview about, the rest of the planet. And most of what, we had heard about Africa or about Islam or about, anything else in the world was kind of informed through an American lens. So when you go to have more of an international lens, I think that just changes things for you. And we were there 4 years and had a lot of hard times and some good times, but you know, overall, as I said, it was great, and we came back maybe just a lot different than we were when we went. So, thank you for that question. I think we're wrapping up. Is that right? Okay. Thank you, guys.